When the smoke cleared from the Second World War, something strange happened. Instead of peace, the world found itself caught between two massive powers who couldn't stand each other, America and Russia. But here's the twist. They never actually fought each other directly. Instead, they spent nearly 50 years playing the most dangerous game of chess ever invented, using entire countries as their pieces. This wasn't your typical war with soldiers charging across battlefields. No, this was something far more sinister and fascinating. It was a battle of ideas, a contest between two completely different ways of living. On one side, you had capitalism, the American dream of making money and owning stuff. On the other side stood communism, the Russian vision of everyone sharing everything equally. Sounds simple, right? Well, it nearly ended civilization as we know it. Don't forget to smash that like button if you're enjoying this wild ride through war history, and hit subscribe because we're just getting started with the craziest stories from the past. The whole mess started with a German guy named Karl Marx who looked around during the 1800s and thought, hey, these factory workers are getting a really raw deal. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Europe and America, bringing incredible wealth to factory owners while workers toiled in dangerous conditions for barely enough money to survive. Children as young as 6 worked in coal mines, people lost fingers in machinery, and entire families lived in single rooms without running water or proper sanitation. Marx watched rich people getting richer, while poor folks worked themselves to death in terrible conditions. He spent years in libraries, studying economics and history, trying to figure out why society was so unfair. His conclusion was radical. The workers would eventually get fed up and overthrow their bosses, creating a world where everyone owned everything together. He wrote thick books about his theories, but the basic idea was simple. The people who actually did the work should control the factories, not the wealthy owners who just collected profits. Marx's ideas spread like wildfire, especially to places where people were already pretty angry about their living conditions. Workers in Germany, France, and Russia began forming secret societies and labor unions, demanding better wages and working conditions. But nowhere were conditions worse than in Russia, where most people were still peasants living under a system that was basically slavery with a different name. Russia in the early 1900s was a disaster waiting to happen. The country was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, a weak leader who believed God had personally chosen him to rule over 130 million people. Most Russians were peasants who owned no land and lived in poverty that would shock modern people. They had no political rights, couldn't travel freely, and were regularly beaten by police for the smallest infractions. When World War I broke out in 1914, Russia was completely unprepared. The army had outdated weapons, incompetent generals, and soldiers who often went into battle without rifles. Millions of Russians died in pointless attacks, the economy collapsed, and people were literally starving in the streets. Bread riots broke out in major cities, and even the army began to mutiny. Enter Vladimir Lenin, a guy with a big beard and even bigger ideas about revolution. Lenin had been living in exile, studying Marx's writings and planning for the day when he could return to Russia and put those theories into practice. When the Tsar was forced to give up his throne in early 1917, Lenin saw his chance. He made a deal with the German government, who secretly transported him back to Russia in a sealed train car, hoping he would cause enough chaos to knock Russia out of the war. Lenin and his gang, called the Bolsheviks, basically said, "Enough of this nonsense," and took over the entire country in October 1917. They kicked out the temporary government that had replaced the Tsar, shot the royal family, which was pretty harsh even by revolution standards, and declared Russia the world's first communist state. Lenin promised that workers would run everything, but in reality, he and his party ended up controlling every aspect of people's lives. The Bolsheviks faced immediate challenges. Most of the country opposed them, leading to a brutal civil war that lasted 3 years and killed millions more people. Foreign armies, including American and British troops, invaded Russia to try to stop the communist revolution. But Lenin's forces were better organized and more motivated, and by 1921, they had won control of most of the former Russian Empire. After Lenin died in 1924, an even scarier guy named Joseph Stalin took charge. Stalin was like that friend who takes board games way too seriously, except instead of flipping over Monopoly boards, he was running a massive country. Born in Georgia as the son of a shoemaker, Stalin had worked his way up through the Communist Party by being more ruthless than anyone else. Stalin decided to turn Russia into an industrial powerhouse overnight, no matter how many people died in the process. His 5-year plans forced peasants off their land and into collective farms, while millions of others were sent to build factories, dams, and railroads in the frozen wilderness of Siberia. Anyone who resisted was shot or sent to labor camps where they worked until they died. The human cost was staggering. Stalin's policies led to famines that killed millions, particularly in Ukraine, where people resorted to eating grass and bark to survive. He became paranoid about threats to his power and launched purges, where he had his own generals, party officials, and anyone else he suspected of disloyalty arrested and executed. By some estimates, Stalin was responsible for the deaths of 20 million of his own people. But here's the crazy part. Most of the world had no idea how bad things were in Russia. The Soviet government controlled all information coming out of the country, and they were very good at propaganda. All outsiders saw was a country that seemed to have jobs for everyone, while the rest of the world was struggling through the Great Depression. When World War II broke out, the Russians fought so hard against the Germans that people started thinking maybe this communism thing wasn't so bad after all. Meanwhile, America was becoming the richest, most powerful country on Earth. The war had been great for the American economy. While Europe and Asia were being bombed to rubble, American factories were running at full capacity, producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies for the Allied forces. By 1945, America controlled half of the world's manufacturing capacity and owned most of the world's gold reserves. The Americans also had something no one else possessed: atomic bombs. The Manhattan Project, a secret program that employed over 130,000 people, had successfully created the most destructive weapons in human history. When they dropped these bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 200,000 Japanese civilians, everyone knew that warfare had changed forever. President Franklin Roosevelt thought he could work with Stalin to keep the peace after the war. Roosevelt was an optimist who believed that if he could just sit down with Stalin and talk things through, they could find a way to cooperate. He even invited Stalin to his home in Yalta, where they discussed how to divide up the post-war world. But Roosevelt died in April 1945, just as the war was ending, and his replacement, Harry Truman, was much more suspicious of Soviet intentions. The trouble really started when the war ended, and both countries found themselves staring at each other across a divided Europe. Stalin wanted to keep all the countries his army had liberated from the Germans under communist control. He figured that if these countries had friendly governments, Russia would be safe from future invasions. America wanted those same countries to be free and democratic, partly out of principle, but also because democratic countries were more likely to trade with America and buy American products. Neither side was willing to back down, and trust between them evaporated quicker than water in a desert. Stalin broke his promises about holding free elections in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern European countries. Instead, he installed communist governments that answered directly to Moscow. Anyone who opposed these governments was arrested, and many were never seen again. Winston Churchill, Britain's wartime leader, perfectly captured the situation when he said an iron curtain had fallen across Europe. On one side, you had Western Europe, rebuilding with American help and embracing democracy. On the other side, Eastern Europe was locked behind communist governments that answered to Moscow. Families were separated, trade was cut off, and travel between the two sides became nearly impossible. Germany, the country that had started the whole mess, was split right down the middle like a broken cookie. The western part, controlled by America, Britain, and France, became a prosperous democracy. The eastern part, controlled by Russia, became a communist state where people lived under constant surveillance. Berlin, the German capital, was also divided, even though it was located deep inside communist East Germany. This created a bizarre situation where you could literally walk from the free world into the communist world just by crossing a street. The Americans had one major advantage: they were the only ones with atomic bombs. President Truman thought this would give him leverage over Stalin, but the Russian leader just shrugged it off. What Truman didn't know was that Stalin had been stealing American nuclear secrets for years through a network of spies that included scientists working on the Manhattan Project itself. The most famous of these spies was Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who had fled to Britain to escape the Nazis and then worked on the atomic bomb project. Fuchs passed detailed information about bomb design to the Soviets, probably advancing their nuclear program by several years. Other spies included David Greenglass, who worked at the Los Alamos laboratory, and his sister Ethel Rosenberg and her husband Julius, who were later executed for their role in the spy ring. In August 1949, the Russians tested their own atomic bomb in the remote deserts of Kazakhstan. The explosion was detected by American monitoring stations, and suddenly the world became a much more dangerous place. America's nuclear monopoly had lasted less than 4 years, and now both superpowers had weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. Both sides started building bigger and better weapons, each trying to scare the other into backing down. The Americans developed the hydrogen bomb, which used nuclear fusion instead of fission, and was 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs they'd dropped on Japan. The first test, conducted on a Pacific island in 1952, completely vaporized the island and created a crater over a mile wide. The Russians built their own version the following year, and soon both countries had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the entire planet several times over. The delivery systems became just as important as the bombs themselves. Both sides developed long-range bombers that could fly thousands of miles to drop nuclear weapons on enemy cities. Then came intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could deliver nuclear warheads anywhere in the world in less than 30 minutes. Submarines armed with nuclear missiles could hide underwater for months, making them nearly impossible to detect and destroy. It was like two people pointing loaded guns at each other's heads while standing in a room full of gasoline. Military strategists developed the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which had the fitting acronym MAD. The idea was that if either side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would retaliate with such force that both countries would be completely destroyed. This was supposed to prevent nuclear war by making it too terrible to contemplate. The competition spread everywhere. In Europe, America launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, basically throwing money at war-torn countries to rebuild them and keep them from going communist. Named after Secretary of State George Marshall, the plan provided almost $13 billion in aid, equivalent to about $150 billion today, to 16 European countries. The plan worked brilliantly. Countries that received American aid rebuilt their economies faster than anyone thought possible. West Germany, which had been completely destroyed by the war, became an economic powerhouse within a decade. France, Italy, and Britain all experienced unprecedented prosperity. The aid came with strings attached. Countries had to agree to trade freely with each other and with America. And they had to resist communist influence. Stalin saw the Marshall Plan as an attempt to buy European loyalty and forbade Eastern European countries from participating. This created an even sharper divide between East and West. While Western Europe prospered, Eastern Europe remained poor and oppressed under communist rule. The contrast became so obvious that communist governments had to build walls and fences to keep their own people from escaping to the West. But the real drama happened in places like Korea and Vietnam, where the two superpowers fought proxy wars. Instead of American and Russian soldiers shooting at each other directly, they armed different sides in civil wars and let them do the fighting. This allowed both sides to compete for global influence without risking direct confrontation that could lead to nuclear war. Korea became the first major test of this strategy. After World War II, the country had been divided along the 38th parallel, with Soviet forces occupying the north and American forces in the south. Both sides installed friendly governments and then withdrew their troops, but tensions remained high. In June 1950, North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet tanks and weapons, invaded South Korea in an attempt to reunify the country under communist rule. President Truman saw this as a direct challenge to American credibility and immediately sent troops to defend South Korea. The war that followed was brutal and bloody, with the front lines moving back and forth across the peninsula. Chinese forces entered the conflict when American troops approached the Chinese border, turning what had started as a civil war into a major international conflict. The Korean War lasted 3 years and killed over 3 million people, including 36,000 Americans. It ended in a stalemate, with the country still divided along roughly the same line where the fighting had started. Technically, the war never ended. Only an armistice was signed, and American troops remain stationed in South Korea to this day. Vietnam was even worse. America got sucked into a jungle war that lasted over a decade, cost billions of dollars, and killed 58,000 American soldiers, not to mention millions of Vietnamese. The whole thing started because American leaders were terrified that if Vietnam went communist, every other country in the region would follow like dominoes falling over. The domino theory became an obsession for American policymakers. They were so scared of communist expansion that they were willing to fight a war they couldn't win in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. The conflict began with a few hundred military advisors sent to help the South Vietnamese government fight communist rebels. But the situation kept getting worse, and America kept sending more troops until over 500,000 American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam. The war was a disaster from the start. American forces were trained to fight conventional battles against other armies. But the Vietnamese communists used guerrilla tactics, hiding in jungles and villages and striking without warning. American soldiers couldn't tell who was an enemy and who was a civilian, leading to atrocities that shocked the world when they were revealed. Back home, the war became increasingly unpopular. Television brought images of the fighting into American living rooms every night, and people began to question whether the war was worth the cost. Massive protests erupted on college campuses, and some young men burned their draft cards or fled to Canada to avoid military service. The war divided American society like nothing since the Civil War. The space race was probably the most exciting part of the whole conflict. In October 1957, the Russians shocked the world by launching Sputnik, a metal ball the size of a beach ball that orbited the Earth every 96 minutes. Americans could actually see it passing overhead at night, a bright dot moving across the sky that represented Soviet technological superiority. Americans freaked out because if the Russians could put a satellite in space, they could probably drop a nuclear bomb anywhere on the planet. The same rocket technology that launched Sputnik could be used to deliver warheads to American cities. Suddenly, America's geographic isolation, protected by 2 vast oceans, meant nothing. This kicked off a competition to see who could achieve the most impressive feats in space. The Russians got off to a great start, putting the first man in space when Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth in April 1961. They followed this with the first woman in space, the first spacewalk, and the first spacecraft to reach the moon. But America wasn't about to be outdone. President John F. Kennedy made a bold promise in May 1961 to put a man on the moon before the decade was over. It was an incredibly ambitious goal. At the time, America had managed only a 15-minute suborbital flight. Kennedy was essentially betting the nation's prestige on achieving something that seemed almost impossible. The Apollo program became the largest peacetime technological project in human history, employing over 400,000 people and costing $25 billion, about $150 billion in today's money. NASA had to invent new technologies, train astronauts for missions unlike anything ever attempted, and solve thousands of engineering problems that had never been encountered before. The program suffered a major setback in January 1967 when 3 astronauts died in a fire during a ground test of the Apollo spacecraft. The accident forced NASA to redesign the spacecraft and led to delays that made Kennedy's deadline seem impossible to meet. But the program continued, and in December 1968, Apollo 8 became the first manned spacecraft to leave Earth orbit and travel to the Moon. Finally, on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the lunar surface. The whole world watched on television as he planted an American flag and declared it one giant leap for mankind. It was one of the greatest technological achievements in human history and a massive propaganda victory for America. Kennedy himself became one of the most important figures of the era, but his presidency was marked by crisis after crisis. The most dangerous moment came in October 1962, when American spy planes discovered that the Russians were secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The discovery created the most dangerous 13 days in human history. Kennedy had to decide whether to invade Cuba, bomb the missile sites, or try to negotiate. His military advisors pushed for immediate military action, arguing that the missiles posed an unacceptable threat to American security. But Kennedy was more cautious, understanding that any military action could trigger a nuclear war. Unknown to Kennedy at the time, the Russians had already moved nuclear weapons to the island and had given local commanders permission to use them if America attacked. Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes were also positioned around Cuba, and their captains had authority to launch without permission from Moscow. If Kennedy had chosen invasion, it would have triggered a nuclear war that could have ended human civilization. Instead, Kennedy chose a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent any further weapons from reaching the island. He also began secret negotiations with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, offering to remove American missiles from Turkey in exchange for the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. The negotiations were conducted through back channels, including Kennedy's brother Robert and a Soviet spy named Georgy Bolshakov. For 13 days, the world held its breath as the two superpowers came closer to nuclear war than ever before or since. American forces were placed on the highest state of alert, and nuclear-armed bombers circled the skies waiting for orders. In Moscow, Khrushchev faced pressure from his own military to stand firm against American threats. The crisis finally ended when Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for Kennedy's promise never to invade Cuba and the secret removal of American missiles from Turkey. Both leaders had shown remarkable restraint under enormous pressure, and their decision to choose negotiation over confrontation probably saved the world from nuclear destruction. The Cuban Missile Crisis scared both sides so badly that they started looking for ways to reduce tensions. They set up a direct phone line between the White House and the Kremlin so leaders could talk to each other during emergencies. They also began negotiating treaties to limit nuclear weapons testing and prevent the spread of nuclear technology to other countries. The 1970s brought a period called détente, which is a fancy French word meaning relaxation of tensions. Both sides were getting tired of the constant confrontation and started trying to get along better. They signed arms control agreements like SALT I, which limited the number of nuclear weapons each side could build. They increased trade, with America selling grain to Russia and buying Soviet oil and gas. The most dramatic symbol of détente was the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975, when American and Russian spacecraft docked together in orbit. The crews shook hands, exchanged gifts, and conducted joint experiments. It was broadcast live on television around the world and seemed to show that the two superpowers could cooperate peacefully. But détente didn't last long. Both sides continued to compete for influence in the developing world, supporting opposite sides in conflicts across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Americans backed anti-communist forces in places like Chile, where they helped overthrow a democratically elected socialist government. The Russians supported communist movements in Angola, Ethiopia, and Nicaragua. The final blow to détente came in December 1979 when the Russians invaded Afghanistan to prop up a communist government there. The invasion shocked the world and convinced many Americans that the Soviets couldn't be trusted. President Jimmy Carter was so angry that he boycotted the 1980 Olympics in Moscow and started secretly arming Afghan rebels who were fighting the Russian army. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, he decided to take a much tougher approach. Reagan had been a Hollywood actor before entering politics, and he understood the power of dramatic gestures and memorable phrases. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire and launched a massive military buildup designed to bankrupt the Russians by forcing them to keep up. Reagan's defense spending increased by 40% during his first term, with money going to new weapon systems like the B-1 bomber, Trident submarines, and MX missiles. He also announced plans for a space-based missile defense system that critics mockingly called Star Wars. The Strategic Defense Initiative, as it was officially known, would use satellites and lasers to shoot down incoming missiles before they could reach their targets. Whether the system would have worked or not remains debatable, but the Russians took it seriously and spent billions trying to counter it. They were already struggling economically, and the additional military spending pushed their system to the breaking point. Soviet leaders realized they were falling further behind technologically and could no longer compete with American military spending. Reagan also supported anti-communist forces around the world, providing weapons and training to rebels fighting Soviet-backed governments. In Afghanistan, the CIA armed and trained Islamic fighters called Mujahideen, who used guerrilla tactics to make life miserable for Soviet forces. The war became known as Russia's Vietnam and eventually forced the Soviets to withdraw in defeat. The pressure was too much for the Soviet system to handle. By the 1980s, the Russian economy was falling apart. People stood in long lines for basic goods like bread and toilet paper. The government was spending so much money on weapons that there wasn't enough left for anything else. Industrial production was declining, and the country was falling further behind the West in technology and living standards. The situation was made worse by a series of aging leaders who died in quick succession. Leonid Brezhnev, who had ruled for 18 years, died in 1982. His replacement, Yuri Andropov, died after just 15 months in office. Andropov's successor, Konstantin Chernenko, lasted only 13 months before he too died. The rapid turnover at the top created uncertainty and paralyzed decision-making. When a young, reform-minded leader named Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he realized that something had to change. Gorbachev was different from previous Soviet leaders. He was younger, more educated, and willing to admit that the system had serious problems. He launched two major reform programs: Glasnost, openness, and Perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost allowed more freedom of speech and press, while Perestroika tried to make the economy more efficient by introducing some market mechanisms. Gorbachev also began withdrawing Soviet forces from Afghanistan and reducing military spending to focus on domestic problems. But Gorbachev's reforms backfired spectacularly. Once people got a taste of freedom, they wanted more. Protests broke out across Eastern Europe, and communist governments started falling like dominoes. The real kind this time, not the imaginary ones American leaders had worried about in Vietnam. The most dramatic moment came in November 1989, when the Berlin Wall, the concrete barrier that had divided the German capital for nearly 3 decades, was torn down by celebrating crowds. People attacked it with hammers, pickaxes, and anything else they could find, turning chunks of the wall into souvenirs. It was the perfect symbol of communism's collapse. A wall built to keep people in was being destroyed by the very people it was meant to control. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself was falling apart. The Baltic republics declared independence, followed by other regions that had been forcibly incorporated into the USSR. A group of hardline communists attempted a coup against Gorbachev in August 1991, placing him under house arrest and sending tanks into the streets of Moscow. But the coup failed when Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, rallied opposition to the plotters. Yeltsin climbed on top of a tank outside the Russian parliament building and called for resistance to the coup. Thousands of people surrounded the building to protect it, and the coup collapsed within 3 days. The failed coup was the final blow to the Soviet system. Gorbachev returned to power, but it was clear that the USSR could not be saved. One by one, the republics declared independence, and on December 25, 1991, 74 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, Gorbachev resigned and officially dissolved the Soviet Union. That evening at 7:32 p.m., the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time and replaced with the Russian tricolor. The country that had once been America's greatest rival simply ceased to exist, splitting into 15 separate nations. It was probably the strangest ending to any major conflict in human history. The most dangerous rivalry ever just stopped. Looking back, it's amazing that humanity survived those decades at all. We came within minutes of nuclear war multiple times, often saved only by the good judgment of individual people who refused to push the button when their computers told them to. The world spent trillions of dollars on weapons that were never used, fought wars in countries most people had never heard of, and lived under the constant threat that everything could end at any moment. But we also achieved incredible things during those years. The space race gave us satellites, computers, and eventually the internet. The competition between the two systems led to rapid advances in science, technology, and medicine. Both sides invested heavily in education and research, producing generations of scientists and engineers who made discoveries that benefit us today. The period also saw remarkable progress in human rights and social justice. The civil rights movement in America was partly motivated by the need to counter Soviet propaganda about American racism. Women's rights advanced in both East and West as both sides competed to show they offered the best opportunities for all citizens. Perhaps most importantly, the experience taught us that even the most bitter enemies can find ways to coexist without destroying each other. The nuclear standoff forced both sides to develop new forms of diplomacy and crisis management. They learned to communicate during emergencies, to negotiate arms control agreements, and to compete without resorting to direct military confrontation. The story of this epic standoff reminds us that history is often stranger than fiction. Two countries that had been allies just a few years earlier became mortal enemies over ideas about how society should be organized. They spent decades trying to prove which system was better, and in the end, one of them simply collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. If you've made it this far, you're clearly fascinated by war history's wildest stories. Show some love by hitting that like button, sharing this video with fellow history buffs, and subscribing for more incredible tales from the past. Trust me, there are plenty more mind-blowing stories where this came from, and you won't want to miss a single one. The legacy of this period still shapes our world today. Many of the conflicts and tensions we see around the globe can be traced back to those decades of rivalry. The division of Korea remains a source of tension, and the weapons and alliances created during the standoff continue to influence international relations. But the period also proved that human beings are capable of both incredible stupidity and remarkable wisdom, sometimes within the same decade. We came close to destroying ourselves, but we also learned how to step back from the brink and choose survival over destruction. The leaders who navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis showed that even in the most dangerous situations, cooler heads can prevail. In the end, the greatest lesson from this era might be that no conflict lasts forever, no matter how bitter or dangerous it seems. The rivalry that once threatened to end human civilization simply faded away when one side decided it was no longer worth the cost. And that, perhaps, is the most important victory of all, the triumph of common sense over ideology, of survival over destruction, and of hope over fear. The world that emerged from this long standoff was far from perfect, but it was a world where people could travel freely, trade openly, and communicate across former barriers. The Iron Curtain that had divided Europe for decades was gone, replaced by open borders and shared institutions. It was proof that even the most entrenched divisions can be overcome when people choose cooperation over confrontation.